Just from the outset, I'm mostly going to talk about polygynous marriage and child health outcomes, and really in the context of Sub-Saharan Africa. And the reason for that is basically because that's where most of the research has been done, and that's where most of the research has focused. Okay, so we don't really have a big literature on polygynous marriage and other types of well-being or in other world regions. So just to start off with some basics, you'll probably all be very aware that polygynous marriage cross-culturally and historically is pretty common. So 83% of societies in the standard cross-cultural sample permitted men to marry more than one wife. Today, the practice is considerably less frequent, but it is quite common in some areas. So it's particularly common in Sub-Saharan Africa, especially across the so-called polygyny belt, which is the area running from Senegal, the Gambia in West Africa, down across to Tanzania and Kenya in East Africa, where around up to 30% of women might be in polygynous marriages. The practice is also declining with economic development. So it's most common in remote rural regions amongst more traditional cultures, and less common in urban capitals, for example, within Sub-Saharan Africa. So it appears to be declining with modernization or economic development. Okay, so in terms of the academic interest in polygynous marriage, there have been two main questions that have been asked in the literature, and this is really anthropologists, evolutionary biologists, and economists, perhaps some sociologists that have been interested. For men, the advantages of polygynous marriage seem pretty obvious, particularly from a fitness perspective. More mates should enable you to have higher reproductive success. But for women, the question of why you should marry a married man, why you should enter into one of these marriages, has been a question of debate. There are two main types of explanation, although each type of explanation contains separate models under that banner. The first would be models of female choice. The most obvious one here being the polygyny threshold model, originally developed to explain avian mating systems in animal behavioral ecology, but also has parallels in economics, particularly the work of Gary Becker on the economics of the family. The basic idea here is that you have variation in male wealth in a population. Females get access to resources mainly via marriage, and so it could make sense to be the second or later wife of a wealthy man compared to being the only wife of a poor man. You may actually be able to maximize or optimize your access to resources by sharing a husband. And the prediction from that perspective is that polygynous marriage should not necessarily have any consequence for the well-being of women or her children. The other type of explanation or set of models have focused on male coercion. So they've argued that polygynous marriage is really the product of sexual conflict with males benefiting at the expense of women and dependents in polygynous marriages. And that then would predict that you should have costs to women's well-being or child health in polygynous marriages compared to monogamous marriages. Or at least that's how those models have tended to operationalize or test their predictions. The second main question that's been asked in the academic literature on polygynous marriage is what accounts for transitions to monogamous marriage with economic development that we've seen. And here there's two main perspectives again. Firstly, Joe Henrich and colleagues, building on some earlier work, have argued that transitions to socially imposed monogamy in large nation states can be explained by cultural group selection. And the argument here is essentially that normative polygyny has two sets of negative repercussions. Firstly, it disincentivizes paternal care, which leads to negative outcomes on the family. And secondly, it increases social unrest by amping up the scramble competition for mates. So basically, there's an urgency around getting mates because unmarried females are in short supply. That leads to a whole set of behaviors which are seen to be negative at the population level. So the prediction then from those kind of perspectives is that monogamous populations will do better at the group level than polygynous populations. Counter to this perspective is a paper or model by Laura Fortunato and colleagues, which has argued that monogamous marriage can actually make sense for men, make sense for both sexes in terms of inclusive fitness benefits, when parental inheritance becomes fundamental to offspring success. And the model this is based on essentially is arguing that monogamous marriage should be understood not so much as a mating system, but as a system of inheritance. So they argue that in many cases, in monogamous marriages, men may have higher reproductive success outside of that marriage. They may pursue other opportunities for mating, but monogamous marriage is fundamentally about inheritance. So if you don't want to divide your land or resources among too many dependents, actually not having too many kids and going for a monogamous marriage can make sense for men. They mainly talk about this in terms of the transition to intensified agriculture. So when productivity becomes land limited rather than labor limited. But it could also account for transitions to monogamy with any kind of transition to a high parental investment strategy, such as what you see with economic development and the demographic transition. Okay, so that's the kind of academic interest in polygynous marriage. Running parallel to this, we have ongoing debates and movements within the international development sector, where we've seen increasing commitments to achieving gender equality at an international scale. This has involved a lot of different people. Most recently, a number of celebrities have kind of got in on campaigns with the UN to highlight the plight of women in other cultures. Emma Watson recently is doing a lot of work on child marriage, for example. The Millennium Development Goals include statements about gender equality. The successor to those goals, which ended in 2015, are the Sustainable Development Goals. They include a more forceful commitment to gender equality, which this time includes stronger statements on cultural practices of developing populations that are seen as universally or innately harmful to women and should be eradicated. Within this framework, then, the UN categorizes polygynous marriage as a harmful cultural practice, which is usually defined as a practice which is seen as blatantly or obviously harmful to women and children, or one or the other. That puts it in the same category as child marriage, marital rape, female genital mutilation. So it's a pretty serious company. It's argued, for example, polygyny violates the constitutional rights of women, can have harmful emotional and financial consequences for women and dependents, and should be discouraged. It's important to note those statements are not made with any kind of reference to evidence. They're just set in there within documentation on harmful practices and not necessarily supported. I just underline traditional because within the policy and development sector literature, the term usually used is harmful traditional practice rather than cultural practice. I'm not using that term because that terminology implies that harmful practices are uniquely non-Western or property of developing populations, when of course we have our own struggles with harmful behaviors in Western populations. There's also been movements not just on foreign policy, but also domestic policy relating to polygynous marriage. Particularly interesting case has been Canada in the recent years. So they've been trying to introduce something called the zero tolerance for barbaric cultural practices, even stronger terminology. In this case, this would allow the Canadian government to deport immigrants that were found out to be within polygynous marriages. That would be a grounds for deportation that's being proposed by the Canadian government. We've also seen a retrial of the legal status of polygynous marriage under the grounds of religious freedom. That was unsuccessful. Just to read you the statement from the Chief Court Justice that was the ruling on this case. The law violates the religious freedom of fundamentalist Mormons, but the harm against women and children outweighs that concern. This case is essentially about harm. This includes harm to women, harm to children, harm to society. So some pretty clear judgment on the negative consequences of polygynous marriage. This is also a particularly interesting case because this was a rare case where there was a real connection between policy and the academy. So in this case, a number of academics were actually expert witnesses as part of this trial, including Joe Henrich, who many of you know is a relatively famous evolutionary anthropologist. And Joe advised that polygynous marriage was indeed harmful. Okay, so within this kind of context, I think my perspective is that we have a kind of duty as anthropologists to really question these statements because they're made usually without reference to evidence, at least within the policy literature. I mean, Joe's review did cite evidence, but most of the work out there is not really delving into what we know from data. It's based essentially on moral arguments. Although it does claim that polygynous marriage is harmful for children, for women, so it makes statements you could test. It's also concerning because I think as much as we want to improve the world and make it a better place, when we start talking about negative cultural practices, we get into a situation which is nicely kind of phrased here, that humanitarian effort fuels ethnocentric disdain. So essentially, if you're saying that the well-being of children in some country is because they have these harmful practices, you're saying that their well-being is poor because that society is morally corrupt. And that kind of statement can have all sorts of socio-political consequences on our relationship with other cultures. So it's important we actually try and treat these claims seriously. Alongside that, we also have movements towards more evidence-based international development, interventions and so on. And within that, I think there's a real opportunity for anthropologists to start being part of the discussion that is being had about what kind of evidence there is to promote certain types of initiatives or programs that are designed to improve the condition or well-being of people that we work with. And I've been working with Mary Gibson on this book on the end on applied evolutionary anthropology, trying to advocate specifically evolutionary anthropology as a theoretical framework that can be useful for the development community. So that's the kind of background on the policy and academic interest in polygynous marriage. What I want to do now is look at large-scale studies which have almost universally supported the idea that polygynous marriage is harmful, and I want to take apart some of their evidence base. So most of the studies that have been done, they've used data from the demographic and health surveys. These are large, nationally representative surveys carried out throughout the developing world since really the 1980s. They contain huge sample sizes. The data is publicly available. It is the main source of data on child health, mortality rates, any kind of demographic rate for the developing world you'll ever read of. It will come from these surveys. They follow a standardized protocol and survey methodology. So in some sense, you might think they'd be well designed for comparative research. And they are, but I would add here they're designed really for making descriptive statistics at various levels of aggregation. They're not actually designed for multivariate analyses, and that's where we run into problems when using this data. So these are 3 studies as an example that have looked at family structure or polygynous marriage and child survival and health using data from African DHS surveys. In all cases, they've combined data from 20 upwards countries and looked at the predictive status of polygynous marriage, relating that to then child health or survival. So for example, Omariba and Boyle, they conclude that compared to children in families where the mother is in a monogamous union, children in polygynous families are 24% more likely to die before 5 years of age. Another paper, children in polygynous families have a 42% higher likelihood of infant mortality compared to their counterparts in monogamous ones. Finally, moving a child from a monogamous to a polygynous household is correlated with a reduction in the height for age Z-score, a marker of nutritional status, by 6.6% of the sample standard deviation. These are large effects, okay? So they're really concluding pretty strong evidence that polygynous marriage is bad for child health. And they've been quite clear in supporting that statement that polygynous marriage is a harmful practice in those papers. The concern that I have with those papers and why I think they are probably wrong is essentially about confounding. They take data, so the data itself, it prioritizes representation at a national level or a regional level, but it collects very few data points per community. Okay, so for example, in Tanzania, they collect between 16 to 22 households per primary sampling unit in the DHS, but a sampling unit is not even necessarily a village. It's an enumeration area for a census. It could be an urban neighborhood. It could be a collection of villages. And you have to take, firstly, really take it on faith that's randomly sampled. But secondly, it leaves you really unable to look at effects within communities. Instead, you're looking at effects across communities and effectively comparing a polygynous subgroup to a monogamous subgroup. And my main concern is that populations like the Maasai that I work with in Tanzania are very marginalized. They're very polygynous. And in these big national data sets, polygyny essentially becomes the kind of marker for being a traditional subgroup or a marginalized subgroup that has not been as influenced by economic development or colonial forces that have pushed them towards monogamy. So polygyny itself in those data sets is not a very good marker of anything at all. And just this kind of a schematic of what I'm talking about, that you might get different relationships within a community than you would between communities, and I'll show you some evidence of that later in the talk. The studies I've mentioned, they have addressed this issue to some extent, or at least they're aware of it. So for example, if anyone here does multi-level modeling or is aware of the issues of data clustering that you can have, they've adjusted for clustering at the nation level, at the subnational region. That kind of adjustment isn't actually very useful because perhaps particularly in Africa, the level of cultural diversity is extreme. These are the different regions in Tanzania. Within those regions, you have all sorts of different things happening. They're not really very sensible, cohesive clusters. Often, regional and national boundaries are driven by colonial, they actually were drawn by colonial powers rather than Africans themselves. They don't really match onto ethnic lines, for example. One study is adjusted for a primary sampling unit, but as I was trying to say to you earlier, they're very small units and they're not actually necessarily pinpointing precise communities, and there are statistical problems with trying to estimate effects using very small clusters. And none of these studies have even attempted to address ethnic variation that might map onto marital status. In terms of the studies which have supported the idea or claim to support the idea that polygynous marriage has negative effects at the population level, you can get some very strong statements. Joe Henrich and colleagues have concluded that normative monogamy reduces crime rates, including rape, murder, assault, robbery, and fraud. A recent paper, just 2016, I will read this because it just sort of hammers home the point of how strong their conclusion is about how polygynous marriage is harmful. We find statistically significant relationships between polygyny and an entire downstream suite of negative consequences for men, women, children, and the nation state, including the following outcomes: discrepancy between law and practice concerning women's equality, birth rate, rates of primary and secondary education for male and female children, difference between males and females in HIV infection, age at marriage, maternal mortality, life expectancy, sex trafficking, female genital mutilation, domestic violence, inequity in the treatment of males and females before the law, defense expenditures, and political rights and civil liberties. So polygyny, according to them, is really terrible, right? This is like a very strong statement made in the Emory Law Journal, which I presume has more likelihood of influencing policy than a paper published in an anthropological journal, right? If you look at the evidence they use, it's appalling, quite frankly. This is a table from their paper. They've done an analysis of 170 countries. They've put in the prevalence of polygyny in each nation. They've adjusted for the GDP, and they find these associations. And that's the evidence base they're using to make those conclusions. That's pretty shoddy scholarship. If you can, I'm sure you can think of many confounding factors that might lead to an association between polygynous marriage over and above adjusting for GDP. But I also just want to point you to the work of Mordiv Jervin on the bottom corner there. Mordiv did his PhD traveling around 16 different African nations and finding the person that calculated the GDP for that country in the last year. And all I can say is that book is a complete horror story of the state of African statistics, okay? It's a wonderful book, but if you see someone adjusting for GDP and think they've just controlled for everything, be aware of some of the issues that will pop up. Okay, so hopefully I've convinced you at least to doubt some of the strong conclusions, and now I'm going to try and provide some evidence that goes in the opposite direction. This is my own work on polygynous marriage in Tanzania. This is a collaboration with a Tanzanian NGO. Terrible name, Savannah's Forever, but they're a wonderful organization, and they collect data for the evaluation of development projects. The NGO is headed by Monique Borgenoff-Mulder, many of you will know, and also Susan James, who's the main person running Savannah's Forever. Very briefly, a bit about the Tanzanian context. Tanzania gained independence about 50 years ago. It is the most ethnically diverse country within Sub-Saharan Africa. It has 120 plus ethnic groups. Ethnicity data is actually not routinely collected in large-scale surveys like the demographic and health surveys, so you can't even look at it if you wanted to. Scores very poorly on the Gender Equality Index. About a quarter of women in rural populations are in polygynous marriages. In terms of child health, they've had some progress, but child health outcomes are still very poor. 5% of adults are HIV positive. And during the period of data collection we're talking about, they also experienced a pretty severe drought in northern Tanzania, which particularly influenced Maasai communities. The data I'm using comes from something called the Whole Village Project. This was a very ambitious project where initially the idea was to collect data across as many villages as possible. We've got 56 villages here. on a whole range of indicators of well-being, and then to use that as the baseline or the kind of framework to embed evaluation projects. So rather than each project starting off and doing its own thing again and again and again, you would have a kind of longitudinal sample across these villages. So I'm talking about data from the first wave. It's 56 villages. Data was collected between 2009 and 2011. It spans 7 different Tanzanian regions, and I'll explain what these colored dots are in a second. It provides multi-level data, so we have data on 56 villages, includes lots of things at the village level like rainfall levels, distance to an urban center, levels of education, service provision. Within those villages, we have data then on about 60 to 70 households per village, which amounts to around 3,500 households. That includes a household roster. Multiple measures of wealth, including not only a household wealth index, which is the main measure kind of favored by demographers and economists doing these big comparative studies, but also more locally relevant measures like livestock and land ownership. Food insecurity, to give you some impression of what food insecurity is like at the site, around 14% of households reported having no food whatsoever at least one day in the last month, so pretty severe levels of food insecurity. Not all households contain children under 5, around 2/3 of them did. That then provides data on around 3,500 children under 5 with their heights and weights, and also their other characteristics as outcome measures. Okay, this is the map I was showing you earlier. There are 4 main ethnic groups here. They're the Maasai, the Sukuma, the Rangi, and the Meru. That's the distribution of groups. They're color-coded by the dominant group in that village, although villages are all to some extent ethnically mixed. The white diamonds are villages where another ethnic group, not one of those 4, dominates. In total, I think we had over 50 different ethnic affiliations listed within the data set. Differences between those ethnic groups. The Sukuma, they're the most common ethnic group in Tanzania. Sukuma, Rangi, and Meru are all kind of to varying degrees. They're farmers. The Maasai, on the other hand, they're mostly semi-nomadic pastoralists, or they are branching into farming. Sukuma, mostly Christian. A large percentage Christian. The Meru, almost exclusively Christian. Levels of polygyny vary. The Sukuma and Rangi have a moderate level of polygynous marriage. The Meru are almost entirely monogamous. They also are relatively educated. If you go back to this map, they're more close to the Arusha city and benefit from the infrastructure of kind of health infrastructure and education services close to the city. But the Maasai are the real outlier. Very high levels of polygyny, doing pretty badly, and they're very much socially and economically marginalized from the rest of the population. There are linguistic differences, there are cultural differences, there are livelihood differences, and they live in relatively remote, drought-prone areas compared to everybody else. You've probably all heard of the Maasai. They're a very well-known population. I was previously working at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine when I started this research. The Maasai Cricket Warriors, which is their small campaign group, turned up at the front door. They do all sorts of activities, even to promote their own well-being. And they've kind of commodified their culture, both within the development community and outside of it, to try and get attention. So there was a huge indigenous rights movement a couple of decades ago. The Maasai joined this movement because essentially their decade of dress was quite successful in getting attention. Within Africa, of course, the term indigenous isn't really that meaningful. Everyone's indigenous in Africa, so it kind of doesn't really make much sense, but they managed to use this movement. In terms of the commodification of the culture, this is a nice picture of a couple of Maasai men admiring the Louis Vuitton collection, which was inspired by the Maasai Mara or whatever else. Pretty terrifying stuff. It's estimated that over 100 million in the last decade has been made from Maasai-themed products, including bedspreads, pens, a range of Land Rovers, all sorts of things had the Maasai name on it or the kind of Maasai tartan. But that fame does not reach the Maasai. There's an ongoing intellectual property dispute with the Maasai and many companies using their name. But in terms of their well-being, that fame does not translate into fortune. So this is a graph with all the villages in the project, 56 villages. The red marks are the Maasai villages, the blue are the Meru, the ones living close to the city, although directly adjacent to the Maasai. And this is height for age, which is a good marker of nutritional status. -2 is the international cutoff for stunting. And what you can see is that, on average, Maasai kids are much more likely to be stunted, and really strong clustering at this village level in terms of well-being. Okay, in terms of the relationship with polygynous marriage, the first thing we did was try to replicate the kind of methodology used in the large-scale studies. So what we did was take all the villages together, aggregate that data, and just look at the relationship, adjusting for a couple of other confounds, between polygynous marriage and child health. So is your household head in a polygynous marriage, and how well are you doing? And what we find is strong relationships between polygyny and low food insecurity and poor child health, entirely consistent with those DHS studies, those big national level studies. However, if we do a multi-level analysis and we look at relationships within villages and stratify by ethnic group, the pattern changes. So in this case, I've got the three main groups that practice some degree of polygynous marriage: Sakuma, Maasai, and Rangi. I've separated out the male-headed and female-headed households. In this context, the male-headed polygynous households are typically households occupied by the husband and his first wife, whereas the female-headed households are separate dwellings inhabited by a second or later wife and her children. These are the outcomes of food security, child height for age, and child weight for height. There's two different measures of nutritional status. The reference line is being in a household with a monogamous male head. And what we see is that food insecurity is actually higher in the polygynous male-headed households than the monogamous households. And in 2 out of 3 of the ethnic groups, there's some evidence that being a child in a male-headed polygynous household is actually associated with better nutritional status rather than worse. This is the same kind of graph, but done using the wealth measures to kind of get at a sense of what's driving these effects. And what we see is that, particularly in terms of acres of land cultivated and amount of livestock, the polygynous households are essentially the richer, wealthier households that are more able to buffer out the costs of food insecurity and provide essentially environments where children are more likely to thrive than the monogamous households. So this is pretty consistent with the female choice model of polygynous marriage, that when men differ in their wealth, when women get access to wealth via marriage, that it may make sense for a woman to marry, to share a husband in order to get access to a better rearing environment for her own children. In terms of the group associations, we wanted to try and test this idea there's a group cost to polygynous marriage. If you look first at the top 3 graphs, this is the percentage of polygynous households in a village, ranging from 0 up to 50%. And then our food security measure and our 2 measures of child well-being. If we just look at it overall without making any kind of adjustment for other potential confounds, the highly polygynous villages do the worst. They are, of course, the Maasai villages, and if you take the Maasai out, these things go relatively flat. But if we adjust for the fact that Maasai villages are very low in rainfall and have pretty low level of service provision, these relationships entirely disappear. And in fact, on the last one, we get a positive association between polygynous marriage prevalence and weight for height Z-scores of children. That's a statistically significant but very modest relationship. So this doesn't seem to be consistent with the idea there's group costs to polygynous marriage, at least on these outcomes, and it casts more doubt on those large-scale studies which don't deal very well with potential confounders. So just to summarize that particular study, across villages, polygynous households have higher food security and poor child health, but within villages, polygynous households are wealthier, and children in male-headed polygynous households do better in 2 out of 3 ethnic groups. That group-level association is fully accountable by differences in ecological vulnerability and socioeconomic marginalization between villages, and doesn't appear to be causal. Of course, it's a cross-sectional analysis, but it doesn't support those large-scale studies. The implication then really is we need to be really careful and try not to ignore ethnic and spatial variation that can lead to spurious associations in these large-scale data sets. And a kind of broader take-home message is that cultural practices of marginalized groups, if it's polygyny or something else, will always look like a risk factor for poor well-being in a poorly conducted analysis, okay? If you live in a marginalized group, anything you do is going to look like a risk factor unless you do, well, it may still look like a risk factor once you do a better analysis, but there are certainly grounds to be misled very easily. And if you combine that with kind of ethnocentric attitudes and a conformist bias, you can see why you might end up concluding that many practices are negative, even though the evidence may not support it so well. Okay, just briefly, I want to go over other small-scale studies conducted mainly by anthropologists that have looked at the association between polygynous marriage and child health. This is a review paper that's currently in review, a review paper in review. It's the table from the paper. I'm not going to try and go through each line. I'm just going to try and summarize the main results that come out of this. There are several studies which report an overall negative relationship between polygynous marriage and child health. Particularly the work of Beverly Strassman in Mali has been influential or been very clear on the negative consequences for child survival in that population. Some studies have found no relationship between polygynous marriage and child health, but the bulk of studies report mixed evidence. So that there's a relationship between child's health and polygynous marriage, but only for certain sectors of the population or certain individuals. So, for example, we've seen associations with wife rank, with children of first wives doing equal or better to children of monogamous wives, whereas children of later wives doing relatively poorly. We've seen in some studies that negative associations only appear in the poorest households in that population. So, for example, in Monique Borgenoff-Mulder's work, and also by factors like maternal health and child sex and age. And we can come back to those results if you're interested in particular examples. Okay. So just in discussion then, I think it's really important that we have this evidence of mixed effects across the literature, but heterogeneity and the consequences of polygyny should actually be anticipated. We should be expecting it. And there's two reasons for that. Firstly, polygynous marriage itself is not a unitary cultural phenomenon, okay? There are many different ways to enter into a polygynous marriage and many different types of polygyny. It varies to the extent to the ways in which spousal recruitment is regulated, the forms of residence, if you live with your co-wives or not, the norms on resource sharing, the norms on divorce. Can you get out of that marriage if it's not something you want to be in? Sexual relations, relatedness, are the co-wives sisters or completely unrelated? It's not a single thing that we should be trying to look for one single relationship. Also, as anthropologists or as economists, we argue that cultural diversity springs from changing payoffs from different behavioral strategies. Okay, we think that this population practices monogamy and this one does polygyny because of the different payoffs to those strategies, right? So we shouldn't expect to have the same consequences in every place. It doesn't make much sense from any kind of real theoretical perspective. What we do have in terms of the current available literature is pretty problematic. Those large-scale studies, I try to argue, are very seductive, but they're highly vulnerable to confounding. Going forward, we need to try to prioritize making contrasts which identify the locally realizable alternatives for women, rather than just comparing completely different types of people in different settings. I think this is quite a difficult pill for some people to swallow. So I recently had a debate with some demographers, I think demographers or economists, on the paper that we had on polygynous marriage in Tanzania. They wrote a reply to our paper and argued that our effects were really just small sample size, that their own study, which had an analysis of 26 different populations across all of Africa, found negative statistically significant relationships between polygyny and child health, and therefore we were just a small fry set of anthropologists that weren't actually able to communicate with them because their large sample size just trumped our study. This amazes me because their own paper has an analysis which it plots out the effect estimates for the effect of polygyny on child health in different African populations. This is the zero line. 15 out of 24 of the populations, their confidence intervals cross zero, so they're actually not necessarily confident there's a negative effect. In Tanzania, where we worked, they had a positive association. But nevertheless, they argued that there should be one single relationship for all of Africa that we should be dealing with, though it doesn't really make sense. Even the Tanzanian estimate is a national Tanzanian estimate where we're talking about a particular locale within Tanzania, which is socioeconomically, demographically, culturally very distinct from the entire nation. So I think it's a difficult pill for economists and development workers to swallow, but we need to do a better job of, as anthropologists, to communicate some of these issues if we want to be serious about actually having our own work have some applied value. What we do have, even with the small-scale anthropological studies, is still a whole set of methodological issues. Typically very low sample sizes, often under 100 individuals, which raises serious concerns. Data sets are very rarely nationally or regionally representative, so from a public health perspective, are they going to listen to us? Across all of the work I talked about, longitudinal data is really rare, so we're almost entirely talking about cross-sectional relationships, which are just really poor at getting at these kind of things. We know that marital status is dynamic. Comparing a monogamous and polygynous household, this monogamous population may become polygynous later on. There are good reasons to worry about selection effects. So perhaps women in polygynous marriages their children do poorly simply because within a population, the women that are entering those marriages are of lower social standing or health to begin with. And that's something we have evidence from in some populations. A lack of studies address mechanism. We don't really know how polygynous marriage translates into different patterns of things like infant feeding or healthcare attendance. There's a lot of confusion over what to actually adjust for in your analyses. Many of the papers adjust for the fact, in their analyses, they adjust for the fact that polygynous households are wealthier, when that might actually be part of the strategy which motivates the woman to get into that marriage in the first place. Particularly the demographic studies have a kind of kitchen sink approach. They just put all covariates in and then see what's left over. It's not going to get at strategies. You need to think more seriously about that. There are big issues of measurement. These studies sometimes measure polygyny as the marital status of the household head, of the parent, of the entire work-eat group, or other kind of markers of economically independent households. The household unit itself is very problematic. In my own study, the household definition, which is the standard, almost universal measure used in any kind of demographic and anthropological study, doesn't make a lot of sense because polygynous families split between households. You end up analyzing the data in a way which doesn't actually make sense locally. And finally, almost all the literature we do have focuses on child health rather than other outcomes. So just to conclude, it's my opinion that available data on child health and polygynous marriage in Sub-Saharan Africa does not support its characterization as a harmful cultural practice. The three reasons for that are that polygynous marriage is not universally associated with poor child health, and there's evidence of some positive associations in some studies. So it can't be labeled as universally or innately harmful. Available literature has some really serious methodological issues, which we haven't got a strong evidence base to make strong conclusions. And finally, I think we need to reject this notion that polygynous marriage is just one single unitary cultural phenomenon and start looking for variation or start anticipating variation, both because polygynous marriage is, of course, a variable institution, but also because you're looking across different environments, and we should expect different strategies to win out in different locales. I just thank my funders. So the UK Department for International Development and the UK Medical Research Council funded most of this work. And my collaborators, Savannah's Forever, Monique Borgenoff-Mulder, Susan James, Mary Gibson, Rebecca Sear, and Caroline Ugla. Get some water. Yep.
So very interesting. Thank you, David. 2 points. One, you framed, I think, quite logically and cogently the relationship between the incidence of polygynous marriage in a given ethnic group or a given community and its degree of marginalization. And by definition, you would expect that the communities and ethnicities that have assimilated to a kind of large urban global culture have better access to education, employment opportunities, global markets, etc. Those people are going to be less traditional, right? So that inherently has to be the case. But it seems to me that it also follows from theory that if the, from say, frame it in terms of female choice, if the payoffs for a woman are of polygynous marriage are a function of the degree of severity and the disparity between having and not having in terms of resources, opportunities, etc. Right? Then you would expect polygyny to be more common among the more marginal groups, not simply because of this question of acculturation and assimilation that it certainly has to be going on, but because you would expect polygyny to persist by virtue of female choice, and I'll come to that issue of female choice in just a minute, precisely in those places where the payoff is the biggest. So if 14% of the time we don't have enough to eat or anything to eat, right?
Yeah.
Then from my perspective as a potentially polygynous wife, the payoffs of being married to a wealthy man are substantially greater than if we're in an urban environment. There's wage income, there are fewer vicissitudes in resource availability. There are a variety of state institutions that stabilize life on a daily basis, right? So it may be the case that the instance of polygynous marriage isn't entirely due just to what you might call a kind of remnant effect, where those people who haven't, become part of global culture still have it. But precisely it's persisting there because that's where it pays more.
Yeah. I totally agree with you. Distribution of marital practices. The sort of shorter term history has been of a strong kind of missionary influence. Right. And I would be really interested in trying to tease apart when do you switch to monogamy because it pays you, or when do you switch to monogamy because it's like a prestige bias or something else. Because certainly the Miru, I mean, that's been entirely their history has been a huge interaction with missionaries. And polygynous marriage is not something you can do. So I think my sort of response is that yes, but I actually am not sure if this is the right data to test it, because sort of contemporary Africa's short-term timescales is different from our evolutionary history and what might have played into distribution. I mean, one thing to say is that in terms of the model that the monogamous marriage results when you actually have a larger concern about parental investment dilution, that does fit a little bit because the Miru picked up intensified agriculture early, whereas the Maasai it's more labor limited and you can breed more cattle and various things. So that does fit a little bit, but I wonder if we need to sort of, I guess I kind of don't, I've had discussions about this paper and I always go back to, it's not a vacuum in this case. This is like, the recent history has been so strong in terms of the influences. And if you can think of a way to design a project where you can get at those different strings that are building on people's preferences, I'd love to do it.
Yeah, just a footnote for that, and then briefly I'll get to the second point. I know a lot of people have other things to say. But, so in terms of missionization, I mean, the standard missionary strategy the world over has been to tie conversion to opportunity, right? So the fact that you get those changes in belief, or at least practice and possibly belief as well, along with changes in family structure and a bunch of other things, is entirely consistent with that, that payoff consideration because of the carrots that missionaries typically dangle and that larger nation states do in support of it.
So one thing that, so Joe Henrich, I've talked with him about the paper, his argument is that our results are entirely consistent and with his model, and the argument being that the Maasai get pushed into marginalized areas because they're polygynous and therefore less able to get their shit together, essentially. And I'm entirely open to that explanation. That's entirely fine. What my problem is the data used to justify the current perspective, which is just weak. So I'm fine to say this is not a full test, there's more ways of doing it, but we need to all be on the same level playing field.
Just to follow up to that, I'm not sure it's true in all areas of the world that people who live in rural or marginalized environments actually have more food insecurity than people who live in cities. I think there's a lot of places where the opposite is the case.
I take your point, and certainly I think in Latin America that's probably particularly likely to be true, but I don't know that that applies in the African case.
Right, maybe not, yeah. There's a lot of food insecurity in big cities, around the world.
There's also a big difference between a formal polygynous marriage system and what you're actually doing. And it's quite possible within urban environments, if you look at it closely, it may not always look like monogamous marriage. Yeah.
So harmful cultural practice, you look at that here with respect to outcomes for children. There's other ways to assess whether practices have cultural harm. I'm particularly curious for your thoughts on the model where polygyny leaves a whole bunch of unmated men who wreak all kinds of havoc that has spillover effects on other people, and thus that would be one mechanism by which polygyny could have harmful cultural
So
practices.
I'm very happy to entertain it. I don't think the evidence base is that strong for it, and there also are some theoretical issues with that perspective. So there's a couple of papers, Ryan Schacht and Mitchell Mulder. Also, I think there's a sexual conflict paper that picks up some of these themes. So the model presented is arguing that unmarried men, the way they get a wife is to behave in ways which are bad for society. The aggressive competition, which is kind of wasted effort, right? That's the argument, and that leads to these group level consequences, which I refer to as not getting your shit together, right? That's kind of the model. An alternative perspective, argued by people like Hannah Coker, for example, to the model on this, it's possible that in that situation where there's high mate competition and there's very few females, you may want to actually try to have the behaviors which women find the most attractive, not necessarily those which can actually compete with men. So that might be a high investing father. It might be a gentle male. It's not necessarily true that you'll have this. I mean, from a theoretical point, not an empirical point. Theoretical point, that's where you would lead to. So, by saying that, I mean there's the whole debate in sociology about the bare branches model of when you have an excess set of men and what that will lead to. But my understanding is the evidence is not as clear cut when you go down to it. If you look at the Ryan Schacht paper on sex ratios, it's not always the case that more unmarried men leads to negative behaviors or higher crime rates, for example. Sometimes it goes the opposite direction. A lot of those studies are also kind of tricky because they often start with the model of, okay, here's my set of populations that vary in sex ratios. Let's use that as a predictive term for crime rates. But they don't often talk about why you have all this variation in sex ratios to begin with and the other factors that might lead to that. So if in one urban capital you have a jail that's sucking up all the men or something, what is that going to do to your outcome? So I'm theoretically, all I can say is, yeah, go for it, but we need to find ways of testing it better. I don't think it necessarily is the only model. Okay. It's not a very satisfying response, but
First, thank you. This was super interesting. This is maybe a simplistic question and sort of belying my ignorance of the subject more broadly, but
go for it.
I'm, thinking about what you had said earlier about dilution of parental investment. It seems plausible that the argument for it being a harmful cultural practice is really just you have the opportunity to have, father more children.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to know, does your data show whether or not there's, a statistically significant difference between the number of children fathered in the polygynous versus
for the men,
monogamous?
polygynous men, I mean, not in this data because we didn't have a reproductive history, but there's plenty of data that men benefit reproductively from polygynous marriage. The data on women is kind of all over the place, and again, it's kind of come down to a dispute on methodology. What are the comparisons you're making? There's a huge literature in demography on the effects of polygyny on female fertility, and it's just not clear cut.
In your small-scale study, you talked about choice. Whose choice is it? Is it the father of the woman or the woman herself? And how does bride price?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I mean, the notion of choice in the theoretical models, it's about getting your interest, not necessarily your choice, right? It's what optimizes your currency of fitness or well-being or whatever. It's not, did you choose it? Because you might well choose something bad for you, and we all do it all the time. Locally, I mean, you're talking about arranged marriages frequently, and we don't have the data in this study to support what's going on. we're starting to collect data here in Mwanza and Sakuma territory on early marriage, child marriage, and looking at the kind of process of arranging a marriage and what's going on. But typically women themselves don't have much choice at all, really. Except when you get to the larger towns or villages where you start to see the emergence of blood marriage. So there's just a lot going on, a lot of variation going on. This data we can't get to it. But
Now, is the husband paying the bride's family
yeah,
in these cases?
yeah.
Just sort of following up on Lynn's point, so what about divorce? So I understandably with arranged marriage they can't exert choice in terms of who they're choosing as a partner, but if there's possibilities for divorce, then a way to exert choice is to decide whether they're going to stick or not.
So I know it's complicated. So yes, so in the Maasai at least, and I think it's the same in other groups here, divorce is allowed. And divorce is pretty common in Tanzania actually, if you look at the records. But the process of getting divorced is interesting. So it's allowed, and you can do it. Being a widow or being a divorcee on your own in a small African village is never really going to be good for you. It's hard. So it comes down to this choice again. So you might not want to be married, but what's the alternative?
They don't get remarried?
They do get remarried, but those households where it's just a female on her own, if there's any kids, they do particularly poorly. Their food insecurity is very bad. They tend to get more accusations of witchcraft and all sorts of things. They don't do very well. The rule among the Maasai is you can go to your village elder and say, my husband isn't treating me well, I should be divorced, and essentially return to my family. And so that's the rule. How that works on the ground, I'm really curious about, because presumably making an accusation of abuse is something that's taken, you have to have a certain level of power and autonomy to do that. What we're trying to get out with future work is to try to look at, most of the development work essentially sees polygynous marriage as bad because it's a marker of low female autonomy. And we're trying to look at it more as a process and look at polygynous marriage as a product of low female autonomy and low resource control, and that whole kind of mess that's going on there. And I say mess because it's changing. It's not static. You can read in ethnography and what the Maasai do, but it's not what they're doing right now. So, yeah, this is what I want to work on, essentially, going forward.
First, this was such an interesting talk, such an interesting conversation, so thank you. And I was just curious, you mentioned that there are so many features and details of polygyny that might vary, and that maybe we should look at it as opposed to this monolithic thing, right? And I was wondering what your thoughts are on those features, like whether they serve particular functions, and particularly in the groups you were looking at, what are the could you just characterize a little bit more what
most
you mean when you
polygyny, mostly throughout Africa, but not universally, it's non-sororal polygyny, so they're not related wives, and they live in separate dwellings. But there are, if you work with the Chimane, for example, in Bolivia, they're sororal polygyny mostly, so it's mostly sisters or close relatives. That, would lead to all sorts of different kind of calculations about the payouts, right? But also within a population, a polygynous bride might be someone entering that marriage at 18 as her first marriage, or it might be a woman entering that marriage at 45, her husband has just died, and it's the levirate marriage, she's being betrothed to her deceased husband's male kin, because the marriage contract is essentially the patriline will take care of this woman, and so it's fulfilled. So entering a marriage as a later wife, as an older woman, and not reproducing with that male, probably not even having sexual conduct with that male, but just actually it's almost seen as if you can't own resources and you can't be one of these widows living on your own, that's an argument for a way in which that society deals with that problem. And they make the marriage contract, you will look after this woman if you die, your family will do it. So they're very different circumstances. And my worry is if you go in and just ban polygyny, that you restrict the option set available within that context. I'd rather see programs focus on female autonomy and resource control, and then hopefully if you have those in place, women will not be coerced in situations that are bad for them or have the freedom to leave them. But in a context with high food insecurity, and you're not like a gold digger choosing a wealthy man, you're choosing that your kids will live. It's hard choices, and competing risks to your well-being. So, but that's not really something. So the whole development community likes simple things, right? So it doesn't deal with complexity in that sense. I would say that child marriage is really where the action is right now, rather than polygynous marriage. It's a little bit on the side. Partly because a lot of African leaders are in polygynous marriages, so it's kind of awkward. It's the truth, so that's kind of how it works. But yeah, those are a couple of things. I mean, in terms of, we talked about divorce, if you can get out. There are varying reports and ethnographies of the degree to which co-wives are cooperative or in conflict. And we can think about why that is and what kind of mechanisms might be at play. But there are lots of different factors. Yeah.
I'm curious, is there a literature on what women think or say about polygynous marriage?
I think Brooke's done some of that.
And what do you say? I mean, is
The
it
volume of her work is so large that it's hard to track.
Yeah, sure. In the HIMBA, we looked at perceptions of polygyny, and actually what I found there was that women, co-wives are helpers there. They're really, which you see in some places but not others. So sometimes they do cooperative labor, and here they do a lot. And then, so when women had other female helpers, typically kin, so the more elder daughters they had, the more negative a perception of polygyny they had. So because you've got these other sources of help, and so we looked at elder daughters versus younger daughters, younger sons, and elder sons, and it was that you only saw this relationship with that one type of child. And then for the women, we asked it of women who were unmarried as well, and for them it was the number of adult female kin in their household, and the more of them they had, the more negatively they thought about polygyny.
So, but across societies, I was curious about, this story, the picture, this large-scale picture you might expect. There would be some cultural variation in ideas about it that would correlate with whether it might correlate with these more biological measures of harm.
I don't think there's attitudinal data at the level of small-scale populations.
Yeah.
Maybe you've asked a couple of university students and has other or something, but it's not going to be like. Part of asking, so we're thinking about asking people about their preferences for their daughters, like how they'd like them to get married, because it's a little bit further removed.
Yeah.
And you do, just piloting stuff, you do see that, it's not uncommon for women to say, I want my daughter to be in that kind of marriage because that's a successful household or whatever. So I'm really interested in trying to get at this situation of flux. It's changing, and the young people themselves are often saying, like the men, I prefer monogamy. I want 2 kids. They've been brainwashed, that's the way to do things, right? And so there's a real conflict going on between the generations. And when you tie that in with the fact that a lot of marriages are arranged, those kind of generational conflicts are going to lead to a whole suite of issues for those populations.
So trying to build bridges with our good friend Joe.
I'm her on camera.
Hi, Joe. And here, this is not something that I have any expertise in at all. I'm just kind of going on vague ethnographic intuitions about Indonesia, and they could well be wrong. Indonesians could well correct me that I'm wrong. But it strikes me that if you track, say, over the last 50 years, the kind of public messages about family structure and marriage in a place like Indonesia, so one of the largest Muslim countries in the world, right? Mm-hmm. Majority Muslim. What you see is initially there's this huge family planning push. Monogamous marriage is held up as the default, the prototype, the expectation, right? Small family size and so on, right? And then with a kind of resurgent Islam, there's something of a backlash against that. But where the two meet is in what you might call a kind of politically moderate Islam, which is that so many interpretations of Islam hold that polygyny is only permissible provided that the husband can adequately provide economically, sexually, spiritually for each of his co-wives and do so equitably, right? And that failure to do that is grounds for divorce on the part of the wife, on any of those criteria. There, what you start to see is you can sort of make out the cultural evolution of a Henrician polygynous, high investment strategy, which is that the modern version of this is much more female autonomy and much more about high parental investment. And so that my very casual impression is that it kind of went from polygyny is backward, right, to shaming polygynous men who should not have been polygynous by virtue of their poverty, right, and not having anything to say about polygynous men where their wives and children were prospering.
The one paper that gets to that anyway empirically that I'm aware of, and again, it may not be that great in terms of methods, I'm not sure, but this paper, Emily's Greenway, I think it's actually in California, they look at the relationship between polygynous marriage and infant mortality, and what she finds is that in the regions with the highest levels of polygyny is more negatively associated with negative outcomes on infant mortality, whereas in the regions that are more monogamous, polygyny tends to be less harmful. And she argues something very similar, that those contexts, there are better, gender equality is more recognized, the rights of women are more recognized, that when polygyny does happen, there's a social enforcement that it should be in a woman's interests, I guess. So there's some debate happening there on that, and I think that's a good way to go. I mean, in the Tanzanian context, I'm not sure. I mean, there's a lot of Muslims in Tanzania and a lot of Christians. It's kind of split down the middle in terms of frequency, and that would be interesting to look at. Yeah, I'm with you. I'm not much more to say. Any other questions? Hi.
So I'm not an anthropologist, so forgive me if this is a silly question, but is there any evidence of polygynous societies having higher rates of inbreeding, which might affect the differences in the levels of the health indicators that you're measuring, that there'd be inbreeding depression that explains it, and not necessarily food scarcity or parental investment?
Not that I'm aware of, but my sort of guess would be that food security in this population is, you can see the determinants of it pretty obviously. It's not, I don't think it's genetic inbreeding, it's the fact that there isn't food. So it's possible. I don't know data on that topic. I have no idea if it exists. You might be more likely to find it in the animal literature than human literature. But in this case, I think what's determining bad health is, is the bigger stuff, is the local ecology.
So just to follow up on that, I don't think that there's a direct link, and again, I'm way outside of my area of expertise here, which is easy to do, it's a very small area. I don't think there's any direct link between polygyny and inbreeding per se. But there is a link between, and this is a cultural link, is between polygyny, preferential first cousin marriage, and inbreeding. So I think if you parcel out the first cousin marriage, there's likely to be no residual effect of polygyny per se. And I don't know that those practices are necessarily variant across communities here. And they're primarily, it's much more common north of the geographical region that David is considering than in the southern part.
Just out of curiosity, because I'm wrestling with some of these same issues about the longitudinal studies, and so you have these cross, because it's so rare, there's a lot of divorce and a lot of sort of flux. So I'm just wondering, because it seems like the health measures are mostly cross-sectional, but the situation that led to that cross-sectional measurement is a result of who knows, do you know of any work that's actually considered things like, an event history analysis or something like that?
I think Jeff Winking has a paper on polygyny and fertility, which compare different approaches. It's a very small sample. and they did find, I can't remember, but the results change depending on which methodology, so it suggests that it's important to do it that way. But on child health outcomes, I'm not sure. It's a really good point. I mean, being stunted by age 5 or whatever is determined by everything before age 5, and that polygynous marriage may have been monogamous at the time that it was collected.
Right.
You know, so it's tricky.
Does your project collect dates of marriage? And
The data that we're talking about here, no, it was really household structure and child outcomes, so we didn't have that data. Going forward, that's the aim is to start working on something longitudinal. So I'll report back in about 10 years.
Okay.
It's going to take a while, but hopefully we can, doing this kind of stuff, you can justify the need for it, right?
Yeah.
So,
Well, that, and then it's like, you know, how many kids there are in the house, all that stuff changes so much.
yeah. There are very few. I'm actually going to a workshop next week in Paris on methods for measuring family structure in Africa, and that's something I'm really looking forward to, because there aren't, you know, we have, I started my PhD on a longitudinal data set of UK families, and there's nothing comparable. And think of the scope of the literature on divorce in the US and child outcomes, right? Then you have like these couple of papers. I mean, it's not comparable at all. So there are, so there's the DHS studies, the Demographic and Health Surveys, the big national surveys. There are these demographic surveillance sites that are in many places, a lot throughout Africa. I think there's 4 in Tanzania, maybe 5. And they are sites where they take like 4 to 8 villages, and they get 80–90% of everyone there. And they've been recording births, deaths, and marriages. It's been mainly used for demographic rates and for sub-studies on malaria, on HIV, whatever else. The project that I'm doing in Mwanza, the other area of Tanzania, is collaborating with them and hoping to use that infrastructure. But what they have right now, their measurement of polygyny has not been a priority, so I can't use it for that. But going forward, if we interact with them, yeah, hopefully. Yeah.
So just returning to the idea of diffusion of parental investment, is one of the things at play then the idea that the kind of investment a father in these circumstances is providing sort of impervious to the number of wives, or like it just like, because I'm thinking about sort of the difference between a traditional sort of Western investment, which is like you help raise the kids, you do this other thing. So is it the sort of thing where the kind of investment that's being provided is sort of does not scale with the number of children that are being produced, or gets scaled down rather?
I'm just trying to work out what you're.
Well, he's trying to draw a distinction between something where parental investment, where as the resource base, for example, that the father has expands, then the divisions of the pie, the number increases, but the size doesn't change, right? But there's some forms of paternal investment, like direct paternal care, which are finite, right? A man may have lots of cows, but he's only got so many hours in the day to bounce babies on his knees. So if it's baby bouncing, then the more wives there are, the less each baby gets bounced.
Yeah, so we have some variation here. I mean, this was the kind of the point that I was trying to make about the subsistence base. And so if you're Maasai and you can always breed more livestock that your environment will allow, maybe parental division or divorce, dilution of parental investment will not be as consequential for you, and so a high fertility strategy is more optimal. Whereas the Meru that have gone to more intensified agriculture, you don't want to give your offspring too small of a plot to inherit, that actually the payoffs to a lot of kids are not the same. And that's the argument that Laura Fortunato has made about why you get the emergence of monogamy with certain subsistence changes in the record. I mean, we need the question. There's bigger questions about what dads do and how they invest in kids, and a lot of it is going to be indirect and hard to measure, because if it's securing a resource base that then you get access to, Doesn't fit our baby bouncing model, but that's certainly activity, right?
Right.
Yeah. I'm not sure that answers your question, but...
Good.
I'm just a little curious about something that you kind of hinted at and then got away from. Maybe I'm just trying to goad you a little bit, but
Go on.
like these quotes here, these are basically rampant mischaracterization of correlation as implying causation. And so you basically said you said that and actually got like faced resistance to that fairly simple idea, and I'm just curious if you want to say a little bit.
Well, I just think it's the norms. I mean, so, like, okay, so most people are anthropologists, right? You've got to assume you know more about cultural diversity or anticipate it more than a, 3 times removed economist or demographer, which does not have that insight, right? I'm not saying it's only anthropologists that know that, but there are different norms around what you look at when you think of Africa. So you think you can just take data from, 26 countries and draw a line, I think that's acceptable. There's a difference there. There's some different norms around what you can do. There's also a problem, like these data sets, they're not designed for these analyses. They're just not, that's not what they're for. They were designed, they're funded for working on the child mortality rate of Ethiopia. That's what they do. They're not for doing these big multivariate analyses. But there's, if you can write a paper that shows something, and we all know that you can publish all sorts of things. The connection between these papers and policy is interesting too, because actually there isn't much of a connection. The policy statements are already there before these papers are going out there. The case in Canada was interesting because they did actually go out and seek academics' input. And I think with this kind of emergence of more evidence-based approaches to development, where you have higher transparency, you have to be accountable and say, why did you make that decision? There's an opening door to actually have this debate. My concern is that anthropologists, as far as the development community are concerned, they do not really think that we do any kind of quantitative work. That really we kind of just sort of translate the local needs of people or say something about what they think, but we're not doing anything that connects with this kind of stuff, the quantitative demography, sociology, economics. But we should be having that kind of debate. And so to do that, I think what we need to do is kind of actually find examples where you show them that these kind of analyses lead to errors. And so that's kind of, more than trying to explain why you have the evolution of polygynous marriage and monogamous marriage, the paper that I wrote, that was the point. It was to try and say, okay, these large-scale data are error-prone. Here's an example where you get a very different result when you do an aggregated analysis when you look within communities. We need to force that message down their throat until they start prioritizing studies which take into account those issues. So they're just different norms. Policy, the simpler your analysis, the more likely it is that you will get a policy person interested in it. You can't go in there and say all this complicated context-dependent stuff. They're not interested in it. So that's one of the other reasons why you have this kind of weird mismatch of research schools. But yeah, I don't know what else to say about it really. I think we just have to try to address what's acceptable and police statements that are made out there. You shouldn't let people get away with. My favorite example is this one. This is just absolutely appalling in my opinion. I think Emory's a good university, right? What's going on? You should not be able to say that. That's being supported by evidence. It's not supported. Okay, it's supported by evidence. This is your evidence, but it's not. You should not be drawing a conclusion. Therefore, we should ban this practice without any discussion of the issues of that kind of data. To be clear, I'm not necessarily anti-banning polygyny. If you want to ban polygyny on moral grounds or ethical grounds, that's fine by me. But if you want to ban it on the grounds that it's bad for children, I expect you to have some discussion about the evidence. So I've been accused of trying to defend polygyny. It's not what I'm doing. I'm just trying to say, let's have a discussion about the evidence that's there.
So I'm tempted to follow up that last statement, but maybe save that for a bit. It seems like income inequality is inherently related to the polygyny threshold model, right? That the flatter the differences between people in the community, the smaller any incremental advantage will be to polygynous marriage. So is income inequality, since demographers and economists, that's something that is clearly on their radar. They think about that all the time and its implications for health and welfare. Is that a leverage point whereby one can introduce the conceptual components of this, and is it something that you can use the data that you have in hand to explore?
Possibly. Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think you're right to try and pick apart what are their hot topics, how do you get them interested. My sort of token of hope is that there is just this general sense right now you can always publish papers that say ridiculous things, right? That's what's going to happen. But in terms of the actual policy literature, the developing community, there is a growing awareness that the data quality is terrible. That's my part of I think it's one of the sustainable development goals is to provide better data. So we need to grab onto that and start promoting anthropology as a theoretical framework and an empirically, clever, smart framework that can come in there and have expertise to be part of this movement. It kind of disappoints me that you have books like Poor Economics, Esther Duflo, writing about we need to go and test stuff and we should anticipate variation and behaviors will have different different consequences in different places. It's behavioral ecology. It's what we do, but we're nowhere near that debate. And this whole evolutionary medicine thing happening, that's wonderful, but this is distinct. I think there's a real scope for getting involved. And it's about, when it comes to cultural practices, that's innately anthropological. I think a lot of the anthropologists that have been involved in these debates previously have not wanted to kind of talk to make recommendations or to be part of the machine, the development machine. So there's been a little bit of kind of offhand kind of relationship. Within our own discipline, there's been there's a reason why we sort of didn't make recommendations for policy based on evolutionary theory for a long time. So there's kind of a shyness there. But yeah, any way you can connect, I think is going to be useful. Next week I'm going to Paris and then Ethiopia. Ethiopia is a workshop on FGM. And that's anthropologists talking to people at Department for International Development about what we can do, how we can talk about that. Because there's now a huge amount of money going into eradicating FGM, eradicating child marriage. And there's a weird situation happening where the people that were historically working on HIV or other issues are now moving into this territory to work on these very different types of behavior. And that's a kind of alarming scenario in a way. So I'm rambling now, but anything that we can do to make a connection point is good.
I think that's it. We're going to take them to coffee after this, so if you want to talk further, please stick around.